Thanks, Sheila. I grew up in the Catholic Church, and after college, I began to go more towards Protestant churches. One thing that I've regularly been taught in both, that Jesus Christ was punished for our sins. God the Father hates sin. And yet, because He loves mankind, He poured out His wrath against sin upon His Son. I've been taught to see the bleeding figure on the cross as the evidence of God's hatred of sin and God's love of mankind. Is that better? Thanks, Nate. This morning, I'm going to call that view into question. The Father doesn't crucify the Son in order to vent His wrath against sin. Let me say a couple things. In terms of some of the lies we believe, they are fundamental. And I think it, depending on whether we believe it or not, puts us on one side of a divide. Not this morning. This will be among the more controversial of the lies we believe. I want to say this up front. I'm going to call some widely held beliefs into question, but I'm not drawing a line in the sand this morning. It's not that here's a line in the sand, and if you don't fall on my side of the line, you're not a Christian or you're defective. I'm not going to say that. This is controversial. You don't need to come over to my side of the line in order to be a Christian. I just want to say that up front. There are theologians I deeply respect who would place themselves on the other side of the line that I will find myself on this morning. In fact, I would say most theologians would place themselves on the other side of the line. So you might say, okay, Mike, why are we talking about it? It seems important to me. I want us to sit and discuss it together. And even though you might not end up agreeing with my conclusions, we will be the better for sitting at the feet of the cross and for thinking about the impact of Jesus' death together. So with that, let's talk about the lie, which is, I believe that God punished Jesus because we sin. If you get your worship folder, take out the sheet located. There's some verses written on it. Look what it says about this ceremony involving a scapegoat. You know what a scapegoat is. A scapegoat is someone who ends up holding the bag. That some other people did something, and the scapegoat is a person who ends up getting held accountable for things that he didn't do. And it's a person who is saddled with the responsibility of others. And actually, the term comes from a Jewish religious ceremony. Let's read about it together. In Leviticus chapter 16, it's written in your worship folder. When Aaron has finished making atonement for the most holy place, the tent of meeting and the altar, he shall bring forward the live goat. He is to lay both hands on the head of the live goat and confess over it all the wickedness and rebellion of the Israelites, all their sins, and put them on the goat's head. He shall send the goat away into the desert in the care of a man appointed for the task. The goat will carry on itself all their sins to a solitary place, and the man shall release it in the desert. On the Day of Atonement, it's what it's describing here, the Day of Atonement, which is the highest, most sacred feast day for the Jews. There were two goats used on the Day of Atonement. The first goat was slaughtered to atone for the places that God met with the people. There was the most holy place, and then there was the tent of meeting, and then there was the altar. These things were places associated with the presence of God. And the first goat was slaughtered because the imperfections of the people tainted these places where God dwelt. And so the animal was slaughtered to atone for the sins and to cleanse those places where God met with the people. So, in effect, it would enable God's meeting place to remain among unclean and sinful people. But then the second goat was brought forward, and the second goat, the live goat, was called the scapegoat. And as we see, the wickedness and rebellion of the people were transferred to the scapegoat. In the first instance, the uncleanness of the people and the sin of the people was transferred to the goat that was slaughtered. This word that is translated wickedness has the sense of active rebellion, willful rebellion, wickedness. And it's this category of sin that was transferred over onto this live goat. And what would happen to this goat, the scapegoat, would enable God's presence to be among the people. Not just the tent of meeting, not just the altar, not just the most holy place, but God Himself would remain among the people. Wickedness, again, is intentional sin and rebellion. If you look in the Old Testament of the Bible, there's two classes of sins. There's unintentional sin, and then there's intentional sin. And what you find in places, if you want to check it out, like Numbers 15, it describes that there are blood sacrifices that atone for unintentional sin. And unintentional means I didn't know about the regulation, or I knew about the regulation and had no idea I was breaking it. That's unintentional sin. And what the texts seem to indicate, sin offerings allowed for unintentional sins to be covered. So, if you committed a sin unintentionally, you could get an animal, the animal was killed as a sin offering or burnt offering, and then your ability to fellowship with God was restored. You say, well, what about intentional sins? And there seems, as I've looked and researched it, this is what I've come up with. I don't believe that intentional sins are covered for by blood sacrifices. If you look at Numbers 15, it describes different offerings for different unintentional sins. And then at the end of the chapter, it tells a story of a man who knew that you weren't supposed to work on the Sabbath, but he broke that law by gathering firewood. Not a huge problem. Moses took this issue before God and was told this person needs to be cut off from among his people. It at best means he is banished. And my sense for the word that he is to be killed, destroyed. Now there were other sacrifices for unintentional sin, but for this intentional sin, which is not a terrible sin, but it was intentional, there was no sacrifice that was offered. He wasn't able to kill an animal because it wasn't unintentional, it was intentional. This was the classification of sins that was put onto the scapegoat. Wickedness, rebellion, that level of sin put onto the scapegoat. And the scapegoat then was sent away into the wilderness. Now let's read toward the end because we've got to figure out what happens to this goat. I mean, if the uncleanness of the people caused one goat to be slaughtered, these are heavyweight sins. And what is God going to do with the scapegoat? The one upon whom all the sins, the intentional ones, were transferred. And again, what we read is halfway through verse 21, he shall send the goat away into the desert, into the care of a man appointed for the task. The goat will carry on itself all their sins to a solitary place, and the man shall release it in the desert. The goat was sent away into the desert, and what do you read? Released. Let go. This is the one that had all the sins put on its head. Released. But that's what happened. This is the goat that should have been punished. The heavyweight sins were transferred to it. There was a church that I heard of that enacted this ritual of the scapegoat. They filmed it. And then they showed this film during the service. And so it was maybe 5 or 6 years ago. And the way they enacted it, it was very true to life. They got this goat and they had the person all dressed up as the way the high priest would have been dressed up. And so they do the thing and send the scapegoat. And my understanding of the way this clip ended is this, that it showed the person going away with the goat. And then the man came back and reported to the people, the goat is dead. so your sins are forgiven. And it was making the point then that, but that's not what this text indicates. The guy didn't go, stay with the goat until the goat died. This goat didn't die. It was released. It was let go. It had sins put on it, and God said, go, and didn't punish it. When it comes to these kinds of sins, intentional sins, it doesn't seem that punishing a sacrifice, or not punishing, sacrificing an animal, can cover those. It seems from this that God released, and I would say then as well, that God didn't punish the scapegoat, and God the Father did not punish His Son. Look what it says in the book of Romans. Again, the verse is under letter V. God presented Him, Jesus Christ, as a sacrifice of atonement. And we'll talk about what that means, through faith in His blood. He did this to demonstrate His justice, because in His forbearance, He, the verse in NIV said, had left the sins committed. I'm going to say that that's a bad translation. It adds a word that really doesn't need to be there. The clear, basic sense of the text is He left the sins beforehand unpunished. Putting had left is, I think, not so much a translation, but an interpretation. And we'll talk about that again a little bit in a sec. I think He left the sins committed beforehand unpunished. He did this to demonstrate His justice, or righteousness really at the present time, so as to be just and the one who justifies those who have faith in Jesus. A sacrifice of atonement, literally, it comes from two words. One is a word that describes somebody whose favor is being expressed. It's somebody who smiles. It's somebody who is gracious, and their attitude towards you is favorable. They're favorably disposed. They're smiling. They're not doing this. They're doing this. That's the one part of the word. The last part of the word is a root that says the means whereby the first part of the word was accomplished. So here's what the word sacrifice of atonement literally means. It's somebody smiling, and the reason that that person is smiling like they are. What is that which ends up causing that person to be favorably disposed? And we have to ask the question with God. What was it that caused God to be favorably disposed? What was it that caused Him to be able to extend forgiveness, to extend release? And that's the question that we're asking. The passage speaks of Jesus as a sacrifice of atonement. But it says, for the life of a creature is in the blood, and I have given it to you to make atonement for yourselves on the altar. It is the blood that makes atonement for one's life. We've talked about this before. If you came in and, say, back there in the entryway into the auditorium, you saw blood on the ground, and blood is unmistakable. Its color, its texture, even its smell. If you looked and came and saw a pool of blood at the entrance to the auditorium, instinctively you would become concerned, because that for us is associated with injury, with death. If somebody spilled that much blood, when we see blood, we think of death. God is not like that. Look what it says. The life of a creature is in the blood. For God, blood does not represent death. It represents life. We look at blood and think of death. God looks at blood and thinks of life. That becomes important because it really has something to say about what does the sacrifice of Jesus communicate from the Father. Blood is that, again, which symbolizes or signifies life. And He gives it to us to make atonement for ourselves on the altar. It gives you the sense then, and we'll make this point. It's a sacrifice of atonement. We are not to see it as life taken in anger. That's not the image. It's not God saying, that's it, I've had it. I've had it. Somebody's going to pay. Now, I love you too much to make you pay, but wait till my Son gets on the cross. He's going to pay. I'm going to take His life and I'm going to pour out on Him the wrath because I need to see blood in order for my favor to be restored. That's not how we're to see it. The blood is not life taken in anger. It's life given in love. It is the bestowal of something that severs a bond between sin and death. And that's what the Bible indicates. The soul that sins dies. And so sin binds us to death, both experientially relative to God and eternally. Bound, chained to death. And there's no way to break that chain. And what God does, He provides an element that breaks that chain. And you know what it is that breaks that chain? It incinerates the chain. Blood. Blood. The blood of somebody innocent dissolves the bond between sin and death. Boom. It's the only thing they can do. Now, why would God do that? It's not that He beats His Son because He's angry. He sees that we're linked to a power that we cannot escape from. And God says, I am going to give you the means by which you can escape. I'm going to give my Son. My Son's going to give His blood. And then that blood can dissolve the bond that chains you by sin to death. Bang! Not life taken in anger. Life given in love. That's how we're to see it. I think what Jesus comes to accomplish. The text back in Romans chapter 3, look what it says in the beginning of this. God presented Him as a sacrifice of atonement. He did this to demonstrate His righteousness, justice, because in His forbearance, let me tell you about that word. God left the sins committed beforehand unpunished. That's what forbearance is. It's not when you express wrath and passion. It's when you don't. Forbearance is when you're exposed to something that has every right to make you crazy, and you restrain your response. So what we find is that at the cross is an expression not of venting, but of not venting. It's not God finally able to take all the passion, the hatred, and finally able to go blah on Jesus. That's not how we're to see it. It's not a place of expressed rage. It's a place of forbearance. That's what the text says. It's a place where God leaves the sins committed beforehand unpunished. And it's the same image, I believe, when sins are transferred to the scapegoat is released, not slaughtered, not butchered, and Jesus is our scapegoat. Now we're going to ask the question, ask and answer. Okay, Mike, the goat went away and lived to eat for another day, but Jesus didn't get to live and eat another day. He was brutally tortured. So what's that about? We'll talk about what that's about. What I'm suggesting, it's not the Father venting His wrath on His Son. That's what I'm suggesting. And again, what I'm saying, and you might say, Mike, I'm not sure I buy that. And now what I'm saying, I'm going to draw a line, and I'm going to go on this side of it, and you can go on that side of it, and that's okay. However, I'm going to call that into question, and again, we'll clap each other on the back, and I'll say, tell me what you think, and I'll tell you what I think, but I think for good reason, and I feel strongly enough to be able to try to explain it clearly in order to generate at least some question in your mind. On our website, there's some things. There's a couple things that we want to offer. I want to clear up a question. We do a couple email type of things. One of them, emails from Mike. If you go onto our website, it talks about Hope Mail, and there's a call for action button that you click. And there's two things. You can sign up to get weekly emails from Mike, and those are weekly. And one a week. I'm doing a shorter version of other things that are associated with the 10 Commitments. This past week, we did another one, A Good is Guaranteed to You. They're not as long as the ones that are in the 40 Days with the 10 Commitments booklet, but they're short little things. I'll continue to send one of those out per week. If you want that email, all you do, go to our website, click the Hope Mail sign up, and then sign up. That's all you do. There's also another email thing. If you didn't get the 40 Days with the 10 Commitments emails that we did last year, you can sign up for that email product. And what will happen, you sign up for it, and then you get, for 40 days, the original 40 days with the 10 Commitments emails. Does that make sense? So if you sign up for Mike's emails, you'll get one a week. If you do the 40 days with the 10 Commitments emails, automatically you get those same 40. And we also have on the front page, there's News and Views. And the News and Views is really our blog. It's the place where the most recent blog entries are located. And you'll notice we'll have a bunch of articles there as we are generating people who are going to apply the message of God's love and unconditional forgiveness and love to areas of parenting, areas of work. What I want to do as well is use that as a place where I can do some writing to be able to give some input. And so you'll find the Case for Grace there, which is going to be a 40-part study, and we just did part 7 this past week. And so it had the thing on the website then, you'll find News and Views, Is God Bloodthirsty? And that is part 7 of what will be once per week blogs, and I'll add one a week. So what do I tell you about these things? Just so that you know some of the things that are available on the website. We're really trying hard to make it an educational place where you're going to be able to get some questions answered. Okay, you know what I want to do, actually? I want to read the one. There's a sheet, and on the top of it says, Is God Bloodthirsty? And this, taken directly from our blog, it's on the News and Views. There's a little bit of it, and it says Read More. You click on the Read More, and you get the whole article. And I'm just going to read it. Follow along. And it talks about this. And by the way, this just happened. I was doing 2 separate things, and they both came together in the same week. That what I was speaking on Sunday is what I blogged about this past week, and that was not intentional. I'd like to say it was, but maybe it was intentional, but maybe not my intent. Maybe his. I'm going to read it. Is God bloodthirsty? Imagine God frowning. Now imagine him smiling. A sacrifice of atonement is the reason for the smile. It is the means by which God's favor is restored. Then it has the text, God presented him as a sacrifice of atonement through faith in his blood. I mentioned it's a study in the book of Romans, so you're going to find a passage every week with some explanation. I'll go on. He did this to demonstrate his justice because in his forbearance, he left the sins committed beforehand unpunished. He did it to demonstrate his justice at the present time so as to be just and the one who justifies those who have faith in Jesus. Jesus' mission on this planet was to function as a sacrifice of atonement. Because of what he accomplished, God the Father smiles. His favor is restored. If you know anything about sacrifices, this might raise some disturbing questions about God the Father. Animals used as sacrifices were slaughtered. Are we to conclude that God looks at an animal bleeding to death and then smiles? This question becomes even more disturbing when we plug Jesus Christ into the equation, when he becomes a sacrifice of atonement. Did God the Father watch his Son die in order to exhaust his wrath against sin? Did God the Father punish sin by punishing Jesus? We read about God's forbearance in the passage. Forbearance means self-restraint. It's the opposite of God blowing his top. Someone who demonstrates forbearance contains anger and wrath. The cross is not a place where God's anger and wrath were unleashed. The cross is a demonstration of God's forbearance, a place where God's anger and wrath were restrained. We read that God had left the sins committed beforehand unpunished. This translation, the NIV, suggests that God saved up the wrath that had been building because of prior human sin and poured it onto Christ. However, another translation, I believe a more accurate one, New American Standard offers this translation. In the forbearance of God, he passed over the sins previously committed. This paints a completely different picture. It suggests that God passed over sins on the cross. It suggests that God demonstrated self-restraint at the cross. It suggests that the cross is a place where sin went unpunished. This image fits in better with Judaism, the religion from which Christianity was birthed. In the Old Testament, God declared, the life of a creature is in the blood, and I have given it to you to make atonement for yourselves on the altar. When we see blood, we think of death. God sees life. God gave the blood in order to give life. God did not vent his wrath on the animal that was sacrificed. The life of the animal was not taken in anger. The life of the animal was given in love. The Day of Atonement is the most sacred day in the Jewish calendar. On the Day of Atonement, the most important sacrifice of atonement was offered. 2 goats were used. The second goat was called the scapegoat. The high priest was instructed to lay both hands on the head of the live goat and confess over it all the wickedness and rebellion of the Israelites, all their sins, and put them on the goat's head. He shall send the goat away into the desert in the care of a man appointed for the task. The goat will carry on itself all their sins to a solitary place, and the men shall release it in the desert. The sins of the people were transferred to the scapegoat. The scapegoat was released. It was not killed. It was not punished. The scapegoat walked away unharmed. God's favor was restored. God demonstrated the same forbearance on the day Jesus died. But what about the savage beating he took? What about the agonizing ordeal on the cross? What about his death? He certainly didn't walk away from the cross unharmed. God the Father did not punish Jesus on the cross. Sinful men did. It says, consider him who endured such opposition from sinful men, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. Jesus is our scapegoat. His blood is not to be understood as life taken in anger. His blood is to be understood as life given in love. Again, what we have to come to is there's still the blood and the death, and that's what the text indicates. Again, let's read now back in the sheet in your worship folder. It speaks of Jesus in Hebrews 12. It says, let us fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him, here's our verse, who endured such opposition from sinful men, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. In your struggle against sin, you have not resisted to the point of shedding your blood. Here's what was happening. The Jews who became Christians, it started off well enough. In Jerusalem, right after the church was birthed, people had resources, they sold land, the proceeds from the land was distributed evenly. Again, it was like the Rainbow Coalition. But then 2 years turned to 4 years, turned to 5 years. There was a persecution and they were driven from Jerusalem. If you were a Jewish Christian, you were ousted or you were in danger of being killed. You moved away from Jerusalem. You had to move into Gentile territory. You lost your neighborhood and you lost your livelihood. What are you going to do? We have 1 out of 10 people right now in America, they say, who are looking for a job. If you were a Jew in Gentile territory, your options were not great. And basically what they ended up doing is working in the fields of Gentile farmers, making not much money. And 5 years became 10, became 15. Because they identified themselves with Christ, their ability to bring enough resources to make a decent life for them, and not just for them now, though. It's their kids now. It's one thing to make a decision for Christ and to jeopardize your own future. But when you move from Jerusalem to Gentile territory and you're working in the fields and now your son's growing up and your daughter's growing up and their ability to find good jobs is nil, that's when you're going to start to take that commitment into question. And that's what was happening. Individuals were saying, Jesus, I'd like to continue to walk with you, but I cannot watch my family suffer. And what they were doing then is leaving Christianity and going back into Judaism. They can go back into the synagogue. They can go back and get good jobs with fellow Jews. And then what the writer of Hebrews ends up saying is this: fix your eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, scorning its shame. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinful men, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. And that's the sense of why did Jesus suffer. What the writer of Hebrews says is to be an example, because following Christ is not pretty sometimes, oftentimes. And he writes to them and he says, you haven't shed blood yet like Jesus did. You've been financially disadvantaged. Have Jesus be your example of endurance. Hang in there. Hang in there. Don't walk away from Christ. Walking from Jesus back into Judaism is walking from salvation to a place where salvation doesn't reach you. He says, this life is too short. Don't give up eternity for the benefit of 30 or 40 years for yourself or your kids. That's what he's communicating. Consider him who endured such opposition. Hang in there. And that with all the passion he can muster. That's what he's writing to these Jewish Christians, that certainly we can understand their plight. The writer points to Jesus and said, look at what he endured. Worship team's going to come up and do a closing song. What are we supposed to think when we look at this? I'm suggesting God didn't punish the scapegoat. Heavyweight sins transferred to the goat's head. The goat was released because there's no blood sacrifice for it. I think we're to understand that in the same sense. At the cross, it's not God venting his sins. It's not God taking blood and looking at it and saying, there! Now I can let you go because somebody had to bleed. There's not death in the blood, there's life in the blood. God says you're bound, and I'm going to give you the blood that will allow that chain to be dissolved, and that the blood of Jesus Christ dissolves the bond between sin and death. If you believe it, and hang in there and remain in believing it. Father, I want to thank you for your Son and the work that he did. Provides blood on your behalf. It's not you giving the something to the Son that he receives. It's both Father and Son giving that which we need to be released from now, from the penalty, and in the future to the presence of sin. Blood. And that blood severs, dissolves the sin-death chain. And what that means is during this life, we can live even though we sin in the realization that there's no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. And as we focus on that, as we understand that, our hearts soften. We are less harsh with ourselves. We're less harsh with others. And then there will be that day when the Spirit will be separated from this fleshly body that fights against, and that it will be placed in an immortal body on the other side of death. And then there will be no struggle. And then sin will not be a problem. We will not be divided. We will be whole. Until then, I pray that you give us the grace in the midst of our tension and our struggle to understand your word to us. There's no condemnation. That is the light that we live in. It's that which softens our heart. Give us endurance and perseverance and encouragement. Reveal yourself to us and through us to others for Jesus' sake. Amen.